Hi, I'm Jolene. My stepfather cuffed me in the middle of a Pentagon briefing and smirked, "You're not even a real officer." I stood there, uniform pressed, wrists burning, as the secure call crackled and froze on the words, "A Black Hawk unit has just landed." But worse than the cuffs was the betrayal I saw in my mother's eyes, the silent agreement that letting him break me was easier than facing the truth. Ever wondered how far family will go to erase you just to protect their lies? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. I slipped off my boots by the front door, the edge of my uniform brushing against the frame as I stepped inside. The house smelled like leftover casserole and burnt coffee, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the weight of the day settle across my shoulders. The lock clicked behind me, a small sound in a quiet home that was never as peaceful as it looked from the outside. Virgil's voice carried from the dining room, all puffed up pride and forced laughter as he entertained the neighbors he'd invited without asking me. I could see him through the archway, hands waving as he recounted the story of how he served the community back in his day, how real men stand up when it counts. His eyes barely flickered when he saw me, and that was enough. He kept talking, ignoring me like he always did. I passed through the kitchen, dropping my bag on a chair, unclipping my name badge, setting it down without noise. The muffled conversation drifted in, filled with cheap wine and smug agreement, each laugh cutting into me more than the last. I rolled my shoulders back, forcing my breath steady, reminding myself that my mission didn't stop because Virgil needed to feel big in his own house. "Come join us, Jolene," he called, just as I reached the hallway. His voice had that tilt, that patronizing lift that made it clear this was a command, not an invitation. I turned, gave him a thin smile, and stepped into the dining room. The table was cluttered with half-finished plates, glasses of wine, and that fake warmth people put on when they're trying to impress neighbors. I slid into a chair at the end, next to my mother, who had her eyes on her napkin, folding and refolding it like it would save her from the embarrassment of her husband's show. Virgil leaned back in his chair, tapping his glass with a spoon, getting everyone's attention with that cheap move he liked so much. "Folks, let me introduce you to our very own little mascot here," he said, nodding toward me. "Our Jolene, playing soldier for Uncle Sam." I blinked, inhaled once, and stayed quiet. A woman across the table, a neighbor with a high blonde ponytail and fake pearls, giggled. "Oh, I didn't know you were in the service, honey," she said, the word honey landing like a slap. "But you don't look like you've seen a battlefield." The room fell quiet, eyes flicking to me, then away. I felt the small scar under my wrist, hidden by my sleeve, a reminder of a convoy that never made it back whole. The images pressed behind my eyes, but I pushed them down, pressing my thumb into that spot under the table to ground myself. "Real soldiers don't hide behind Zoom calls, Jolene. You know that, right?" Virgil's words slid out, loud enough for everyone, each syllable heavy with accusation. He was daring me to say something, to break, to make a scene. I turned to my mother. She stirred her coffee, eyes down, as if the steam was more important than the words that hung in the air. I felt my jaw tighten, the muscle along the side of my face pulsing as I held back everything I wanted to say. "Not here, not now." "You're awfully quiet tonight," Virgil said, tilting his head, his smile thin and cruel. "What's wrong? Can't take a joke?" I lifted my glass of water, taking a slow sip to keep my hands steady. "Nothing's wrong," I said, voice calm, even though my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The neighbor's husband, a heavy-set man with a red face from the wine, chuckled. "Isn't she just an admin in uniform anyway?" I set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the napkin, breathing in the silence that followed. My mother shifted, but still said nothing. "If you only knew who you were talking to," I thought, biting down on the inside of my cheek to keep from saying it out loud. They didn't know the classified calls, the hours spent coordinating operations, the times I'd held the lives of soldiers in my hands while sitting in a locked room with a headset digging into my scalp. They didn't want to know. I stood, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and gave my mother a small nod. She glanced up, her eyes flickering with something like apology before dropping again. "Excuse me," I said quietly, and I left the table, moving through the kitchen, past the fridge with its smiling magnets, out the back door into the cool night air. The sky was dark, the porch light flickering overhead, buzzing like it was straining to stay alive. I stood there, letting the breeze push against me, pulling the chill into my lungs. I tilted my head back, looking up at the stars hidden behind the suburban glow, and whispered, "If you only knew who you were talking to." I turned back toward the house, the porch light flickering, the air heavy with everything left unsaid around that dinner table. Stepping inside, I closed the door quietly, letting the soft click echo in the hallway before I moved past the empty dining room, the ghost of last night's laughter still clinging to the chairs. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house as it settled into the cool night. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was pushing through the blinds, painting lines across the guest room's beige walls. I sat up, letting the stiffness in my back remind me I wasn't in my own bed. The air smelled faintly of coffee drifting in from the kitchen, the scent wrapping around me like a memory of mornings that used to be easier, when I was too young to understand how people could smile at you while twisting the knife. Pushing back the blanket, I moved to the small desk I'd set up against the wall. My laptop sat there, exactly where I'd left it, but something felt wrong. The chair was pulled back slightly, the lid of the laptop not fully aligned, a tiny gap at the corner. My heart thudded once, hard, before settling into a steady, cold beat. I sank into the chair, pulling the laptop toward me, running my thumb across the fingerprint scanner. It hummed awake, the screen flickering to life. My eyes scanned the system logs, each line a confirmation of what I already knew. The device had been accessed an hour and a half before I woke up. No login, just the lid lifted, the motion sensor triggered, the camera briefly activating. I closed my eyes for a second, pressing the heel of my hand against my chest, steadying my breath before looking around the room. The door was still closed, the lock hanging there uselessly, mocking me. I should have known better. Sliding the laptop back into place, I stood and moved to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, watching the droplets run down the drain as I forced myself to calm down. There was no room for panic. Not here. Not now. The floor creaked outside the bathroom, and I stepped out to find Virgil in the hallway, coffee mug in hand, his face the picture of casual comfort. He leaned against the wall, watching me with that thin smile I'd learned to hate. "You should really learn to lock your doors, Joe," he said, swirling the coffee like he was stirring soup. "It was locked," I replied, my voice steady, watching his eyes for any sign of guilt. There was none. "Doors around here don't mean much if you've got nothing to hide," he said, shrugging, taking a sip before pushing past me toward the kitchen. I followed him down the hallway, each step measured, grounding myself in the rhythm of my boots on the old wooden floor. The kitchen was warm, the sunlight cutting through the window above the sink, catching the steam rising from the coffee pot. My mother was there, back turned, fussing with a skillet, the smell of eggs and butter filling the space. She glanced over her shoulder, eyes darting between us before quickly returning to the pan. "Anyone want eggs?" she asked, her voice too bright, too forced, as if the air wasn't crackling with tension. "I'm good," I said, leaning against the counter, crossing my arms, keeping my eyes on Virgil. He didn't bother to sit, just stood there, sipping his coffee, smirking like a man who thought he had control of every room he walked into. I wanted to ask him why he felt the need to invade even the smallest bit of privacy I had in this house. But I knew better. Men like Virgil didn't answer questions. They turned them into accusations. I turned to my mother later, when Virgil stepped out onto the porch to take a phone call, his voice loud and performative even from outside. She was rinsing dishes, her hands moving quickly under the water. "He was in my room," I said quietly, watching her shoulders stiffen. "He's just worried about you," she replied, not turning around, not meeting my eyes. "Worried?" I repeated, the words sour on my tongue. "Is that what we're calling it now?" She sighed, setting the plate down, wiping her hands on a towel before finally turning to face me. Her eyes were tired, lined with years of looking the other way. "Joe, it's just easier if you don't make things bigger than they need to be," she said, her voice soft, pleading. I swallowed the frustration, pushing it down where it would stay hidden, where it wouldn't disrupt the fragile peace she was so desperate to keep. "Right," I said, nodding, even though everything inside me was screaming. Later, I returned to my room, locking the door behind me, sliding the latch quietly before sitting back down at my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I forced them to move, resetting every security protocol, every biometric lock, every layer of encryption. I could feel him watching from the hallway, even if I couldn't see him, the weight of his presence pressing against the door. If he wanted a war, he just declared it. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me blurred for a moment before the lines sharpened, reminding me exactly where I was. The quiet of early Sunday crept in through the crack in the curtains, the chill of fall seeping through the glass as I pulled the blanket off and sat up. I glanced at my laptop on the desk, the screen dark but somehow watching me back, the reflection of my own tired face waiting for me to decide what to do next. I needed an adapter for the secure system, one I had stored years ago when moving too quickly between bases and temporary homes. I pulled on a sweater, running a hand over the back of my neck as I stepped into the hallway, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I paused at the kitchen doorway, half expecting Virgil to be there with his coffee and smirk, but the room was empty. Crossing the living room, I stepped into the garage, the light flickering above me as it warmed up, casting long shadows across boxes and tools. The smell of old cardboard and oil hit me, grounding me in the space as I scanned the shelves for the adapter. My eyes caught a box on the top shelf, the words, "Joe's Junk," scribbled in thick black marker. I stood there for a moment, letting the memory of that handwriting settle in, the way Virgil used to label everything in this house, every piece of it claimed, even the pieces that were mine. I dragged over a step stool, the metal scraping against the concrete floor as I climbed up, pulling the box down carefully and setting it on the workbench. The dust puffed up around it, dancing in the light as I pulled open the flaps. On top was the West Point graduation program, its edges yellowed, the seal still embossed but faded. I traced my fingers over it, remembering the day I received it. The crisp uniform, the weight of the hat in my hand, the crowd that blurred when I scanned for my mother. I could still hear Virgil's voice behind me that day, leaning in close as I tried to spot her in the stands, saying, "Don't let that piece of paper give you a big head, Joe." I remember standing there, my diploma in hand, alone in a sea of families taking pictures, the air thick with the scent of grass and sunshine, and the weight of knowing no one saw me walk across that stage. I pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to see the medal I received for the mission in Afghanistan, the ribbon still folded neatly, untouched. Underneath it lay the plaque my unit had given me, congratulating me for leadership, the edges now scratched, the engraving barely visible under a layer of dust. My jaw tightened as I picked up the plaque, the sharp corner pressing into my palm, reminding me I was still here, that I hadn't disappeared no matter how much they tried to act like I had. I held it there, letting it bite into my skin until the sting became familiar, anchoring me in the moment. The door to the house creaked, and I glanced up to see my mother in the doorway, her eyes flicking from the box to my face before she looked away, her hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing holding her up. She opened her mouth like she might say something, but then she closed it, stepping back into the house without a word, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway. I stared at the empty doorway, the silence between us louder than any argument we could have had. I turned back to the box, pulling out the plaque and slipping it into my backpack, zipping it up carefully. I wasn't leaving it here again, wasn't letting it sit in a garage collecting dust while they pretended it didn't matter. Closing the box, I pushed it back onto the shelf, stepping down from the stool and letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The garage felt colder now, the light overhead humming softly as I slung the backpack over my shoulder. Walking back through the house, I paused at the living room, the morning light spilling across the floor, catching on the edges of picture frames that lined the mantel, none of them with me in them. I swallowed the bitterness, letting it settle in my chest like a promise. A reminder. Back in my room, I set the backpack down, pulling out the plaque and placing it carefully next to my laptop on the desk. I stood there for a moment, looking at the reflection in the dark screen, seeing the woman I had become, the one who wasn't waiting for someone to stand beside her anymore. This time, I'm not walking alone. I lay there in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen blending with the creaks of the old house settling into the cold hours before dawn. Every sound made me listen harder, the rustle of leaves outside, the faint vibration of a truck passing on the street. Waiting, listening, because I knew the quiet would not last. Morning finally came, a gray Monday that felt like it had teeth. I rolled out of bed, pulling on my uniform pants and a long-sleeved shirt, brushing my hair back and tying it in a low knot. I set up my encrypted system on the desk, checking connections and signals, testing each secure layer before the call. My pulse was steady, but I could feel it in my throat as I glanced toward the door, making sure it was locked. Twice. On my way to grab coffee before the call, I stopped at the fridge, eyes catching on a note stuck under a magnet shaped like a faded apple. "Stop acting like you're better than the rest of us." No name, no signature, but I didn't need one. The handwriting was Virgil's, the same heavy scrawl that had labeled my box in the garage. My jaw flexed, but I kept my breath even, slipping the note into my pocket before pouring coffee into my travel mug. I walked back to my room, the scent of coffee grounding me as I closed the door, locking it again before sitting at my desk. The call started, the screen lighting up with a series of coded signals before the faces of my team appeared in their small boxes, each of us locked in different rooms, different states, but tied together by the urgency of the operation. I straightened my back, clearing my voice as I began to brief them, my tone firm, the words precise. Movement under the door caught my eye, the shadow of boots pacing slowly back and forth. Virgil. I kept my voice steady, my hand adjusting the microphone slightly as I continued to lay out the updated exfil plan for the team overseas, detailing extraction points, timing, risk factors. My secure system blinked a soft red, an alert popping up at the edge of my screen. Unknown device detected, signal proximity within 3 feet. He was trying to listen. I kept going, my voice calm, eyes steady on the screen as if nothing was wrong, but inside, a cold fury took root. I finished the call, shutting down the secure system, logging out and powering down the hardware completely before standing up, my hands pressed flat against the desk to keep them from shaking. I stepped out into the hallway, the air feeling too still. In the kitchen, Ramona stood by the sink, holding her coffee mug so tightly I thought it might crack. "He's just trying to protect the family," she said, eyes fixed on the window over the sink, the words so quiet I almost missed them. I blinked, letting the silence stretch before answering, my voice level but edged with steel. "From what, Mom? From me?" She didn't answer, just sipped her coffee, turning away as if the conversation had never happened. I went back to my room, my mind already turning, cataloging, recording each moment, each word. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for air, the sky heavy with clouds that felt like they were pressing down on the house. Mrs. Lathrop from across the street waved me over, her expression pinched with curiosity. "I heard from Virgil that you're not really who you say you are, Jolene," she said, forcing a small laugh like it was a joke, but her eyes were sharp, waiting for me to crack. I smiled, small and cold. "Funny, people say all sorts of things when they don't know what they're talking about." She blinked, her mouth opening and closing once before she turned away, heading back to her porch, her eyes darting back at me like she was afraid I'd say more. I stood there for a moment, letting the cool air wash over me before heading back inside. I locked the door behind me, moving to the bathroom and shutting the door, leaning against it as I let out a slow breath. Tears stung at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes for a moment before straightening. No more tears. I went to my laptop, logging the day's events into a secure file, each detail carefully documented, building the record I would need. I whispered to myself as I typed, each word clear and deliberate. "He thinks I won't fight back." The light outside faded, the quiet of the house turning sharp with the darkness. I caught sight of Virgil through the window, standing in the yard, phone to his ear, pacing. His voice carried just enough for me to catch the words. If she steps out of line, I have what I need to take her down. I stood at the window, watching him, the anger inside me settling into something sharper, something that felt like the calm before a storm. And I knew, in that moment, it was war. The morning came gray and sharp, the kind that makes you feel the cold in your teeth when you breathe in too fast. I pulled on my uniform, buttoning each piece with slow precision, forcing my mind to clear as I tied my hair back. The mirror reflected a face that looked older than yesterday, but my eyes held steady. Today was not a day to break. I moved quietly through the hallway, careful not to let the old floorboards creak as I made my way to the kitchen for coffee. The house felt too still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the next crack in the foundation. As I reached for the mug, I saw a piece of paper folded in half, slipped just under the edge of the coffee maker. I opened it, my hand staying steady even as my chest tightened. A photo, heavily redacted, a blurred image of me standing with generals, lines of black ink blocking out details, and across the bottom in thick marker, "Stolen valor?" I folded it again, slipping it into my pocket before taking my coffee, each sip bitter but grounding, reminding me that I was alive, that I was here, that I wasn't going to be pushed down by a coward playing games in the shadows of my mother's house. Later, I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, smirking as if he had been waiting for me. Virgil's eyes were bright, that kind of brightness that hides something rotten underneath. "This is your last warning, Virgil," I said, my voice even, calm, the kind of calm that comes when you've seen real fear and know this isn't it. "Leave my work alone, or you'll answer to the federal government." He laughed, short and ugly, shaking his head as if I were a child telling ghost stories. "You think your little act scares me? I know what you are, and I'll prove it." I didn't move, didn't blink. "Try it." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You're nothing but a fraud playing dress-up, Joe, and I'm done pretending otherwise." I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I went back to my room, locking the door, leaning against it for a moment to let the tremor in my hands settle before logging into my secure system. I checked every setting, every encryption layer, scanning for breaches, feeling the weight of the day pressing on my spine. In the afternoon, as I returned from a walk around the block to clear my head, I heard voices from the living room. Ramona's voice, small, confused. Virgil's voice, slick, confident. "I'm just saying, Ramona, look at this," he said, the tone of a man who thinks he's already won. She admitted it herself right here. I stepped into the doorway, watching as Virgil held up a phone, playing a clipped recording of my voice, spliced and cut so it sounded like I was saying things I never said. "Joe, is this true?" My mother's voice broke, her eyes flickering toward me, then dropping to the floor. "Mom, you know who I am," I said, quietly, my heart tightening as I watched her wring her hands, the lines in her face deepening as she refused to look at me. Virgil turned to me, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "She doesn't want to believe it, but I'm just trying to protect her, you know? Protect this family from you." The room felt cold, the air thin as I stood there, refusing to step back, refusing to let him see me crumble. I looked at Ramona, willing her to lift her eyes, to see me. But she turned away, her silence louder than any accusation. I left the room, going back to mine, locking the door behind me, each click of the lock echoing like a promise. I sat down, pulling out the small case I kept tucked away, feeling the scar on my wrist where shrapnel had grazed me during a convoy attack. I traced it with my thumb, grounding myself in the memory, in the knowledge of who I was and what I had survived. "They will not break me," I whispered, opening my laptop, logging the day's events, every word, every look, every slight movement, building the case I would need. That night, I didn't sleep. I moved through the room, checking the seals on my equipment, resetting encryption protocols, testing silent alarms, setting up backups to the backups. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small LED on my laptop, blinking slowly like a heartbeat. I sat back in my chair, looking around the room that felt both like a bunker and a prison, breathing in the quiet, letting it fill me until I felt steady. Tomorrow, I take back control. I adjusted the collar of my uniform, feeling the fabric press against my neck, reminding me I was still standing. The morning light crept through the blinds, cutting lines across the floor as I set up for the live encrypted call with the Pentagon. Each motion was deliberate. Power up, confirm encryption, check backups, glance once at the emergency triggers near my elbow. Coffee was still steaming on my desk, untouched, the smell grounding me in the moment as I aligned my notes. Today was critical. The operation required precise coordination, and I wasn't going to let anything or anyone compromise it. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge down the hall. I double-checked the lock on my door, confirming the indicator turned red. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as the secure line opened, the screen splitting into 4 windows, each showing a different high-ranking officer waiting, their faces calm, controlled, prepared. "Good morning, Colonel," I said, nodding, as I began to brief the unit's positioning, weather updates, and exfiltration routes, my voice steady while my mind remained sharp on the details, weaving between their questions and the satellite maps that flickered on the side monitor. 22 minutes into the call, I heard it, a soft click, followed by the slow rattle of the doorknob turning. My throat tightened, but I kept my eyes on the screen, muting my mic, leaning slightly back. "Secure call in progress. Do not enter," I called out, each word even, controlled, refusing to show fear. The handle stilled for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it would stop. Then the door exploded open, splintering as Virgil shoved it aside, stepping in with his chest heaving, his eyes wild. In his hand, a pair of cuffs caught the morning light, glinting as he moved forward. "Hands behind your back now," he shouted, spit flying, his voice cracking under the weight of his rage. "You're not a real officer, and I'm taking you in." I stayed seated, the secure call flickering on the screen behind him, one of the colonel's faces freezing mid-sentence. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my face didn't move. "You're making a mistake you can't undo," I said, my voice calm, each syllable measured, reminding myself who I was, what I had survived. He lunged, grabbing my arm, jerking me up from the chair, forcing my arms behind me. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into my wrists, pinching the skin as he snapped them shut, his breath heavy against my ear. "You think you can play us all for fools, huh?" he hissed, pushing me toward the wall, pinning me there as the call continued, the voices on the screen mixing with the pounding in my ears. In the hallway, I heard footsteps, quick and light. Ramona's voice came next, a gasp, sharp, cutting through the chaos. "Virgil, what are you doing?" He didn't turn, didn't loosen his grip as he barked back, "Protecting this country from a fraud." I turned my head enough to see her, standing there in her robe, hair falling loose around her shoulders, eyes wide and wet as she clutched the doorframe. "Mom, look at me," I said, my voice cracking for the first time, just once as I locked eyes with her. "You know me." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She took a step back, shaking her head, whispering, "I don't understand. I don't." Virgil laughed, a low, ugly sound, pressing the cuffs tighter as he leaned in. "They're going to know, Joe. They're all going to know." On the screen, the call flickered again, one voice cutting through just before the feed froze completely. "A Black Hawk unit has just landed." The room went silent except for the sound of my breathing, heavy, controlled, as I stared straight ahead, refusing to look down, refusing to give him that victory. Outside I heard it, a distant rumble growing louder, engines roaring, tires screeching as black SUVs pulled up in front of the house. The vibration of it traveled through the floor, through the soles of my boots, up into my bones. Virgil's grip faltered for a fraction of a second as he turned his head toward the window, eyes narrowing. And that was the moment everything changed. Doors slammed open, boots thundered up the steps, and voices barked commands that cut through the stale air like blades. For a second, the entire hallway froze, even the light seemed to pause on the scuffed floors. Virgil's hands tightened around my arms, but I could feel the tremor in his grip as heavy footsteps approached. "United States military, step away from Major General Jolene Baird immediately." That voice snapped through the chaos, crisp and undeniable. Virgil's head jerked toward the stairway, his face paling as two uniformed officers appeared, weapons holstered but ready, eyes locked on him with cold focus. You're not..." Virgil stuttered, his breath coming in short, panicked huffs, as if he was choking on his own disbelief. One officer, tall with steely eyes that missed nothing, stepped closer. "Sir, you are detaining a federal officer during an active classified operation. Hand over the key now." I could feel Virgil's hesitation like a pulse, his mind clawing for a way out, a way to twist this into something that made him the hero again. His mouth opened and closed before he finally stammered, I thought she was lying. She's been hiding things, pretending to be something she's not. I was protecting this family." The officer didn't blink. "You have compromised a federal operation. You will be processed accordingly." His words were calm, but they slammed into Virgil harder than any fist could. I felt the tension break as Virgil's shoulders sagged, the key dropping from his trembling hand. The second officer moved in, unlocking the cuffs from my wrists. The metal released with a click, and I pulled my arms forward, rubbing the raw skin where the edges had dug in. Ramona stood in the hallway, clutching the frame, her eyes darting between me and Virgil, tears rolling down her lined cheeks. Her voice came out small, like a child's. "Major General?" The title echoed in the hallway, cutting through years of disbelief, dismissals, and small humiliations. I turned to face her, adjusting the collar of my uniform, my spine straightening as I met her gaze. "Yes, Mom." Virgil stumbled back, his legs giving way as he collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, shaking his head over and over. "I was trying to protect you all. I thought she was dangerous. I thought..." The officer beside him didn't flinch, pulling out a set of cuffs, placing them around Virgil's wrists with quiet efficiency. Virgil looked up at me, his eyes wide, the reality sinking in too late. "Joe! I didn't know..." I leaned down, my eyes level with his, letting the weight of this moment settle between us. "This is who I am." He looked away, unable to hold my gaze, his lips trembling but silent. Ramona's sob broke the silence, her body folding as she sank to the floor, clutching the edge of the doorway, her tears dripping onto the old wood beneath her. How did it come to this? I stood there for a moment, the chaos settling into a heavy quiet, the officers moving efficiently around us, checking their radios, securing the scene, clearing the hallway for exfiltration. Outside, I could hear the engines of the SUVs idling, ready to take Virgil away, the final pieces of this twisted puzzle falling into place. I looked down at the marks on my wrists, red and angry, a reminder of what it took to stand up for the truth in a house that had tried to bury it. The officers guided Virgil to his feet, leading him toward the stairs as he muttered to himself, his world collapsing around him, the illusion of control gone in an instant. I turned to my mother, who looked up at me with eyes full of regret and confusion, her lips moving silently as if searching for an apology she didn't know how to give. I reached out, touching her shoulder gently, just once, before stepping past her. As Virgil was led out the door, the morning light streaming in highlighted the dust in the air, each speck floating like a memory in the silence that followed. The door closed behind them, and I stood there in the middle of the hallway, the quiet pressing in on all sides, the echoes of what was said and unsaid filling the space that once was my mother's home. As the front door closed behind them, I stood alone in the silence of my mother's house, hearing every unspoken word echo in that emptiness. The scent of coffee that never got finished still clung to the air, mixing with the faint antiseptic smell from the wipes the officers used when they secured the scene. I found myself tracing a finger along the groove of the wood where Virgil's boots had scuffed the floor, the quiet pressing down on me. I didn't know how long I stood there before I finally moved, stepping into the kitchen, the late afternoon light slanting through the window, catching the particles in the air like gold dust. The street outside was calm, neighbors pretending not to watch as black SUVs rolled away, leaving behind the house that once hid the worst parts of us. My uniform felt heavy on my shoulders, still crisp but carrying the weight of the morning. I unlatched the top button, letting myself breathe as I walked down the hall. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn halfway. Ramona sat on the couch, her shoulders hunched forward, clutching the old, tattered program from my West Point graduation in her hands. She didn't look up when I entered, her thumbs rubbing over the faded letters, smudging the paper further. "I didn't know," she finally whispered, her voice shaking like a thin branch in the wind. "I didn't see how much I let him hurt you." I lowered myself into the armchair across from her, the leather sighing beneath me. The silence stretched, heavy and raw, neither of us willing to break it too soon. It felt like the first honest quiet we'd shared in years. She looked up at me, tears streaking down her lined cheeks, eyes searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I chose peace over truth, Jolene. I chose him over you." I didn't nod, didn't offer empty comfort. I let the words hang there, let them settle where they needed to. She needed to say it, to hear herself admit it, maybe for the first time. "You let him tell you who I was," I finally said, my voice even, but it wasn't cold. "And you believed him because it was easier." Her lips trembled, and she pressed the program to her chest as if it could somehow shield her from the truth sitting between us. I stood, crossing the small space to kneel in front of her, looking into her eyes, letting her see the hurt and the resilience that lived side by side within me. "I can't fix what you let him break, Mom, but I won't let him break me anymore." She nodded, a small, broken gesture, her fingers clutching the paper tighter. I stood and left her there, letting her grief be hers, letting her sit with the choices she made. As the sky darkened, I drove to the holding facility, the hum of the tires on the road grounding me as the lights of the city flickered on one by one. The security guard nodded, letting me in, the scent of stale coffee and industrial cleaner hitting me as the door buzzed open. Virgil sat behind the glass, the orange jumpsuit stark against the washed-out color of his skin. His eyes lifted when he saw me, and for a moment, the bravado he carried so easily was gone, leaving behind a man who looked older, smaller than I'd ever seen him. I picked up the phone, the cord cold in my hand. He mirrored me, his hand shaking as he lifted the receiver. "I was scared," he said before I could speak, his voice cracking. "I thought I was protecting her. I raised my hand, palm out, cutting him off. "You don't get to talk first this time." He closed his mouth, his eyes darting down before looking back at me, searching, pleading. "You didn't just doubt me, Virgil," I said, my voice calm, precise. "You tried to erase me. You tried to convince the world that I was a lie because you couldn't handle that you were wrong." He shook his head, tears pooling in his eyes. "I didn't know. I thought you were pretending." "You weren't protecting her," I continued, leaning forward slightly, letting my words cut through the glass. "You were protecting your control, and it's over." He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, desperation leaking through the cracks in his composure. "Does she still love me?" he whispered, the words barely carrying through the line. I paused, letting the question hang, letting him sit in it. "That's for her to decide now," I replied, and I set the phone down gently, standing as his eyes followed me, wide and hollow. The walk out of the facility felt like stepping through water, each step deliberate, the cold air outside rushing against my face, clearing the last remnants of his voice from my ears. I touched the faint marks on my wrists, feeling them not as wounds, but as reminders of what I would never let happen again. Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the engine, the headlights casting long beams across the dark lot. I took a breath, letting it fill my lungs fully, letting it out slowly as I whispered into the quiet car. "I'm done apologizing for who I am." The road home was quiet, the moon hanging low, casting silver across the rooftops as I drove. Each turn brought me closer to the house, but it felt less like home and more like a place I was ready to leave behind. At dawn, the first rays of light slipped through the blinds as I packed my bag, ready to leave that house for good. The room felt smaller with each item I folded into the canvas duffel, my uniform laid carefully on top, boots cleaned and polished, medals wrapped in a soft scarf so they wouldn't rattle. I moved quietly, the floor creaking under my steps, each sound reminding me of every morning I had spent here trying to stay invisible. I paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the space that once felt like a sanctuary but had turned into a battlefield. The picture frames lining the hallway caught the glow of sunrise, photos of birthdays, graduations, and family dinners, most of which I wasn't in. It didn't hurt the same way anymore. It was a fact, not a wound. In the kitchen, the scent of coffee I hadn't made yet filled the air from the pot Ramona had started brewing before I woke. She was there, standing by the counter, her eyes puffy, hair tied back, holding something small in her hands. I stopped, letting the morning's quiet fill the space between us. Without a word, she stepped forward, pressing a small envelope into my hand. It was thin, the paper soft from years of being handled, the edges frayed. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the contents, a note, folded neatly, placed inside a clear, protective sleeve. My breath caught as I recognized the handwriting, the faded ink that read, "We're proud of you, Jolene. Don't let anyone tell you different." It was the note from my West Point graduation, the one Virgil had thrown in the trash, telling me not to get a big head. She had found it, kept it, and now handed it back to me. Ramona's voice trembled as she whispered, "I'm sorry. You turned into everything he said you couldn't be." I closed my hand around the note, holding it against my chest for a moment before sliding it into the front pocket of my bag. "I know, Mom," I said softly. "I'm not staying, but I'll call." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop me, didn't plead for me to stay longer. She just nodded, her hand lifting as if she wanted to reach for me but dropping back to her side. I walked to the door, each step deliberate, the cool morning air brushing against my face as I stepped outside. The neighborhood was waking up, sprinklers ticking across yellow lawns, dogs barking in fenced yards, neighbors peeking through curtains as they pretended to check their mail. Some looked at me with cautious nods, others with shame, their eyes darting away when I met their gaze. As I loaded my bag into the back seat of the car, a notification buzzed on my phone. Virgil's face flashed on the screen in a local news update, stripped of his badge, dismissed from law enforcement, under federal monitoring for abuse of authority. The headline was simple, clinical, but it carried the weight of every moment he tried to take from me. I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. The drive to the base was quiet, the roads nearly empty, the rising sun casting long shadows that flickered across my windshield. At the gate, the young officer on duty snapped to attention, saluting sharply. "Morning, Major General Baird." I returned the salute, pulling forward, the wheels crunching over the gravel, each bump a reminder that I was driving into my own life, not the one others tried to carve out for me. Inside, the hallway hummed with low conversation and the shuffle of boots on tile. I passed familiar faces, younger soldiers looking at me with respect, not fear, not doubt. The echo of my steps was steady, matching the calm inside me. I stopped before the briefing room, glancing at my reflection in the narrow window. The faint marks on my wrists were still visible, pale reminders of the cuffs that once bit into my skin. I touched them lightly, letting the memory pass without bitterness. "These are reminders, not shackles," I whispered to myself, straightening my spine, feeling it align not from duty, but from a certainty I had earned. I opened the door, stepping into the room, the hum of screens and the quiet click of keyboards filling the air. I nodded to the officers who stood, acknowledging me with a crisp, "Ma'am," before returning to their stations. I took my place at the head of the table, opening my laptop, the screen flickering to life, the seal of the United States military reflecting back at me. As I prepared to begin, I let my eyes scan the room, letting the moment settle around me. I wasn't just commanding an operation. I was living my truth, unapologetically, in a room where decisions mattered. The wounds left by my family's silence would never fully disappear, but they didn't control me anymore. My mother's inability to protect me was no longer a sentence I had to carry. Virgil's attempts to diminish me only strengthened the foundation I stood on. This was my life, on my terms. Before I spoke, I turned slightly, as if addressing an unseen audience, letting the words find their place in the air. For every daughter told she's too much, too loud, too ambitious, let them talk, I said, my voice even, clear. You have nothing to prove, but everything to live. And with that, I turned back to the table, ready to begin the briefing, the door closing softly behind me as the new chapter of my life began.